In 1945, when the guns fell silent, the world was bankrupt and exhausted. Across 3 decades in which empires crumbled, new players with new ideologies emerged. A world centuries in the making had been dismantled by a world war. Ten years after Versailles, 10 years before the German invasion of Poland, nothing was predictable. Nothing was inevitable. The 20s had been a time of hyperinflation, violence, and uncertainty. But they had also been a time of radio, the talkies, and jazz. Most wanted nothing more to do with war. But some were in their minds, in their hearts, still at war. On October 23rd, and no one quite knew why, a deluge of sell orders dropped Wall Street 20 points. The ticker tape machines could not keep pace and ran 2 hours behind. The market opened steady on October 24th, but at 11 a.m. it was overwhelmed by sell orders from all over the country. RCA, the sweetheart stock, was down 35%. Trouble was afoot in New York City, and no country would escape this financial crisis. The Wall Street crash of 1929 set off a global chain of events.
In popular mind, many people think it's the event that triggered and caused the Depression. That's really not a sustainable proposition. But it did expose all kinds of things, the fragility, the vulnerability of the American banking system, the vulnerability of the whole complicated system of international credit and capital flows, all of which came to a screeching halt, and the world was plunged into a depression. It was a global phenomenon. It affected virtually every country with anything that even looked vaguely like an advanced economy. And it owed to the great global disruption of the First World War a decade or so earlier.
The Weimar Republic had survived hyperinflation, but the austerity measures taken in response to the 1929 crash pushed people to the edge.
The Great Depression had, by any way we can measure this, more powerful and more devastating effects on Germany than any other country in the world.
And there, extreme and extremely simple solutions were being offered.
The liberals seem to be hapless, especially as the Great Depression starts, and many Germans consider the liberals to be unpatriotic. It seems out of touch. It's not dynamic. It's not new. That leaves the Nazi Party, which is ultra-nationalist. It's mobilized against the left and against the liberals, and it seems to be dynamic and forward-looking.
In the June 1930 state election in Saxony, Nazi support jumped to 14%, and at the national election in September, it rose to 18.3%. From almost nowhere, Hitler controlled the second largest party in the Reichstag.
The strongest voter base of the Nazis was found in the predominantly agrarian regions in the Protestant north and west of Germany. In these regions, farmers and estate owners and agricultural workers had been active in a series of protests against the deterioration of their economic livelihood from the mid-1920s.
During the summer, as many as 34,000 National Socialist meetings had been staged throughout Germany. No other party got close.
The Nazi Party was the first catch-all party in German history. It appealed to a broad cross-section of Protestant Germans across all social strata.
The Soviet Union was largely insulated from the Depression by its controlled economy. But its citizens were not insulated from need. The peasants did not slide silently into collectivization. Around 113,000 peasants were deported from the Ukraine. And they did not want to be relocated to work on larger farms. It began to show. The secret police, the Cheka, reported 402 revolts in January 1930, 1,048 in February, and 6,528 in March. Almost 14,000 riots and revolts involving 2.5 million peasants in 1930. Predictably, the consequence was not economic growth, but one of the greatest man-made famines in history. It was not so tragic for the stalwarts of the 1914 to 1918 alliance, but they were not exactly prospering. In Britain, Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald confided to his diary in 1929, "Unemployment is baffling us." And it heralded the economic crisis that would soon consume the world. After the Wall Street nightmare, American banks called in their loans to European banks. So the European banks called in their loans to European industry. So industry laid off workers or closed its doors.
Germany was firmly in the grip of the Great Depression, with production output in free fall, many businesses going bankrupt.
Harry Seepman, an advisor to the governor of the Bank of England, said, "This, I think, is it. And it may well bring down the whole house of cards in which we have been living." Harry was right.
This caused mass unemployment in most European countries. It caused a raising of tariffs and higher prices. And governments responded through austerity and deflationary strategies. This caused very widespread economic suffering.
The Depression was a prodigious disaster for Japan, a country dependent on foreign trade and bereft of natural resources. It would trigger the first, but not the last, major military adventure to revive the ambitions of 1914 to 18.
If we tried to put ourselves in the mind of an army officer in the late 1920s, early 1930s, this had been a lost 10 years or so where the diplomats had tried, perhaps it was a noble experiment, but it really led nowhere. We've got the solution, and it's necessary instead actually to take territory and to make it part of the Japanese Empire.
In August, a policy guide produced for the Japanese Armed Forces General Staff emphasized the need to cultivate a general understanding within Japan and abroad of the necessity to use force in Manchuria.
As a result of Japan's victory over Russia back in 1904-05, Japan received, among other things, what the Japanese called the South Manchurian Railway Company.
And this becomes the beating heart of Japan's economic empire in northeast China. At the same time that they invest in building up the Manchurian Railway, they also are authorized by the terms of the lease to station a militia. And so they establish what becomes the Guangdong Army in the area. And that's the base of operations. And the Guangdong Army, like the South Manchurian Railway, become really important kind of institutions in terms of independent operators in the Japanese Empire.
Shortly after 10 o'clock on September 18, 1931, a bomb exploded alongside the South Manchurian Railway.
The Mukden incident, or the Manchurian incident, it was known, involved the explosion on a small set of railway tracks near a city in northern China. And this explosion was actually set off by Japanese officers.
The first bomb of what would be a long war. Rogue elements of Japan's Kwantung Army had engineered the incident to falsely legitimize the complete takeover of Manchuria.
Initially, the higher command in Tokyo quickly said, stop, don't do anything more, just leave things where they are. But the part of the whole plan was, we want the whole force out of Manchuria because we have to have a freedom of operation here. And so one pretext after another followed and gave the officers on the ground the excuse to move from one city to the other.
Within weeks of this event, the Japanese army essentially took over the entire area of Manchuria.
The invasion doubled the size of the Japanese empire and acquired for it a not inconsequential realm. Manchuria had mineral resources, it had space, and it produced half the world's supply of soybeans. The great powers in Asia between the wars were European. Britain, France, and the Netherlands controlled vast territories, but they had been weakened by the war. Their economies were in trouble, and militarily, they were distracted by events in Russia, Italy, and Germany. They were in no position to confront Japanese aggression, and pinned their hopes for peace on a conference. The official opening of the International Disarmament Conference, 60 nations in attendance, was set for February 2nd, 1932, in Geneva. It had to be delayed as news arrived of Japan's attack on Shanghai. Kwantung Army took the city of Qinchao on January 3rd. The last remnant of Chinese administration in Manchuria was evicted, and the Kwantung commanders began erecting the scaffold of a puppet state, Manchukuo.
Once this state is created, then just enormous resources are poured into developing Manchuria. And this is sort of as part of Japan's effort to create a national defense state, to build up and prepare the nation, its capacity for fighting total war.
Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, was installed as emperor of Manchukuo on March 9th. His role was purely decorative. Six days after, Japanese generals announced a ceasefire in Shanghai. Two days after the establishment of Manchukuo, the League of Nations passed its resolution critical of Japan's action.
And in this report, commissioners recommended that Western powers adopt a policy of non-recognition of Manchuria. But the problem was the likes of Britain didn't want to kind of formally adopt this policy because it would threaten their relationship with Japan.
The Japanese government have found themselves compelled to conclude that Japan and other members of the League entertain different views on the manner to achieve peace in the Far East. I need hardly add that the Japanese government persists in their desire to contribute to human welfare.
From May, civilian politicians were confined to minor roles in Japanese cabinets. Unsurprisingly, military expenditure began to climb. By 1938, it was 12 times what it had been in 1931. In the US, the Depression bottomed out in 1932, by which time production had fallen 25%, investment 50%, prices 10%. Only unemployment had risen to more than 20%. On February 26th, Hitler swore his oath as a civil servant in the Office of State Culture and Measurement in Braunschweig, a hastily contrived arrangement which technically gave the Austrian German citizenship and allowed him to become a candidate in the presidential election. The German presidential election was held on March 13th, with a runoff on April 10th. The Nazis, following Hitler's resounding defeat by Hindenburg, found their support falling. The movement's appeal had clearly peaked.
Support for the Nazi Party at the ballot box dwindled substantially. During that tumultuous year, they lost about 2 million voters. Yet they were still the largest party by November 1932. And so no coalition government could be formed against them, which placed them obviously in a very strong position.
On January 1st, 1933, the Frankfurter Zeitung proclaimed, "The mighty Nazi assault on the democratic state has been repulsed." And the Fascische Zeitung declared, "The Republic has been rescued." But the Nazi Party's assault was only just beginning. Germany had 3 different chancellors during 1932. Heinrich Brüning, Franz von Papen, and Kurt von Schleicher. All Hindenburg cronies, and all failed to secure Hindenburg control of the Reichstag.
Their parties did not have enough representation in the Reichstag to form an anti-left, anti-socialist, anti-communist coalition. They needed the Nazi Party, but they did not trust the Nazi Party. They did not trust Hitler. And neither, of course, did the president, Paul von Hindenburg, who refused to appoint Hitler as chancellor.
In the summer of 1932, when von Schleicher conveyed to Hindenburg that Hitler would join a government, but only if he were appointed as Chancellor. Hindenburg's immediate reaction was to dismiss him as that Bohemian corporal. He only changed his mind starting in late 1932, when von Papen, behind the scenes, negotiated a new coalition that would, in one way or another, involve the Nazi Party.
Of the appointment, von Papen said, "Within 2 months, we will have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he will squeak."
And here they made the single most catastrophic political miscalculation in modern history. Hitler could not be controlled, not by anyone.
What Hitler stood for was plain enough. In February 1932, General Renaudot, the French military attaché in Berlin, warned his government that if Hitler becomes Chancellor, Germany will be transformed into one huge military barracks.
A widespread longing for a strong leader was a hallmark of political mentalities throughout the Weimar Republic, which ultimately then benefited Hitler, who could present himself as somebody who resembled the people.
After his swearing in, Hitler began to issue orders. Uniquely, his was a revolution that followed the acquisition of power. The revolution was a top-to-bottom assault. It was pledged to the seizure of territory, the pursuit of a racial policy, and a reordering of society that had many facets. Just after midnight, on the evening of the 27th of February, passers-by heard the sound of breaking glass coming from the Reichstag. And shortly afterwards, saw flames begin to light up the interior of the building. Arriving on the scene, Hitler, Goering, and Goebbels declared the arson attack to be a communist plot.
4 communists are now on trial in danger for their lives in Leipzig. They are accused of burning the Reichstag.
Marinus van der Lubbe, a callow Dutch communist of uncertain mental competence, was found guilty.
All of that evidence comes down to a pretty clear consensus that Marinus van der Lubbe could not possibly have set the fire that destroyed the main chamber of the Reichstag with the time and the tools that he had available to him. So there had to have been someone else involved.
Hitler used the attack to take a major step toward building a dictatorship in Germany and killing off what was left of the Republic. And that came through the Enabling Act, which suspended the Constitution and its guarantees of civil liberties.
To make sure no politician reneged, stormtroopers ringed the Reichstag, yelling, "We want the bill, or fire and murder." The bill had a fancy name: the Law for the Alleviation of the People's and the Reich's Misery.
Männer der deutschen Revolution!
When Hitler was appointed as Chancellor, he had 2 immediate concerns. The first was to shore up his popular legitimacy by a resounding victory in those elections. The second step, which took more time and was ultimately only finished over the course of 6 months from late January to July 1933, was to get rid of all the other competitors in the political arenas.
By May 1st, a Gadarene rush to join had so overwhelmed the party apparatus that a ban was placed on new membership. Of the 2 million paid-up Nazis, 1.6 million had joined since Hitler's swearing in as Chancellor. The poet Heinrich Heine, who died in 1856, wrote, "When books are burnt, in the end, people are also burnt." On May 10th, his books were among the cartloads consigned to the bonfire. In Berlin, the book burning was attended by university dignitaries, part of a crowd of 40,000 who watched books go up in flames and listened to academic speeches. Hitler had been in power for exactly 100 days. By July 11th, only one political party existed in Germany, and by law, only one was allowed.
Adolf Hitler, Heil!
In October 1933, Hitler announced the dissolution of the Reichstag, setting fresh elections for November. Of course, by law, there was only one party, and so it was not properly an election. Rather, it was a vote of confidence, and 92.1% of the electorate declared their confidence in Hitler. Sir Horace Rumbold remarked from his post as His Majesty's ambassador to Berlin that many in the diplomatic corps have a feeling that we are living in a country where fanatics, hooligans, and eccentrics have got the upper hand. Other countries merited the same judgment. He is, Yanis Rudzetak said of Stalin in January 1933, the leader of the most revolutionary, most militant party in the world, and he would not be the leader if he didn't know how to chop off and destroy that which is slated for destruction. Spring was the epicenter of the great and vicious Ukraine famine, the Holodomor. The death toll, concealed in the secrecy of the Soviet era, may have been 3 million or 7 million. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, Stalin admitted to Churchill that deaths associated with the famines following collectivization totaled 10 million. He was almost certainly understating his achievement. The League of Nations inquiry into Japan's invasion of Manchuria took almost a year to report.
The League of Nations actually organized a committee or a commission to investigate whether or not the Japanese takeover of this area was actually legal. And the League came back to say no, that this seizure was illegal and it was a violation of Chinese sovereignty.
Japan found it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
Japan quit the League of Nations, which the American ambassador in Tokyo told his president indicates complete supremacy of the military.
Within Japan, there were powerful voices pushing back against the commercialism of the 1920s, and the most powerful voices came from within the Japanese army.
In the United States, powerful voices were coming from men in suits, and they were hoping to turn the tide. On March 4th, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States of America.
This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper.
On the same day, the banks in 28 states were wholly closed. Those in the remaining 20 were partly closed.
There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
But in that address, it's worth noting that there's only about a paragraph, maybe not even a full paragraph, devoted to international relations or to foreign policy. In fact, he starts out his presidency, whatever his thoughts in the back of his mind might have been about the international order, without really giving it any priority in his policy programs. It's the domestic crisis that consumes virtually all of his energy and attention at that moment.
On Sunday, March 12th, the new president began the first of his radio broadcast fireside chats with, "My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking."
Let me make it clear that the banks will take care of all needs. And it is my belief that hoarding during the past week has become an exceedingly unfashionable pastime.
Roosevelt is a great innovator in what we might call the techniques of the presidency. The fireside chats were a stroke of genius because Roosevelt, through them, spoke directly to the American people on the radio, people in their homes, in the evenings.
The day after the president's speech, Americans were queuing to put their money back where their president promised them it would be safe. 2 days later, the New York Stock Exchange reopened after a 10-day hiatus, and the Dow leapt 15%, the largest single-day rise in its history. By April, more than $1 billion had been pulled out of socks, jars, from under mattresses and floorboards, and deposited in banks. On April 19th, Roosevelt took the U.S. off the gold standard. His budget director, Lewis Douglas, thought it the end of Western civilization. But the Dow went up like a rocket. Orders for new machinery increased by 100%, and overall industrial output lifted by 50%. June 14th, 1934, saw the first keenly anticipated meeting between Mussolini and Hitler take place in Venice.
The location has been chosen by Mussolini, the date has been chosen by Mussolini, and it's very clear that Mussolini is the elder statesman in this equation, and it is Hitler who's being very deferential to Mussolini.
After their meeting, Mussolini complained to De Vecchi, his representative at the Vatican, that Hitler had sounded like a broken record, banging on about the Jewish Christ and the activities of German Catholics. In Germany, the army leadership was increasingly alarmed by the posture of the Sturmabteilung, the brown-shirted SA, as an alternative army, now 4.5 million strong.
The sort of core activists within the brown shirts were, in a sense, much more radical than Hitler. In particular, they wanted themselves to become the core of a new army, and they wanted to get rid of Germany's traditional army and its traditional officer class.
The failing health of President Hindenburg made resolution of the problem urgent. The president was head of the armed forces, and when Hindenburg died, would the generals perhaps prefer a head of state less identified with and beholden to the SA than Adolf Hitler? The solution was not immediate, but it was thorough. History knows it as the Night of the Long Knives.
Lurking behind this, too, was the idea that Hitler wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be a return of the old monarchy, of the Hohenzollern dynasty that Kaiser Wilhelm had come from. There were some who were advocating that perhaps the Kaiser's son could come back and be emperor again. Hitler didn't want that, so he wanted to move quickly to make sure that that wasn't a possibility, and he wanted to consolidate his own power.
2 weeks after returning from Italy, Hitler launched the purge. Its victims were factional opponents, the SA leadership, and a few targets of personal grudges.
The message here was absolutely clear. Hitler was not going to be controlled by Germany's conservatives, and ultimately, the most important outcome, in addition to the further consolidation of Hitler's dictatorship, was the door was now open for the rise of the SS to become one of the most powerful institutions in the regime.
When Hindenburg eventually died, the jobs of Chancellor and President were combined in the person of one leader, or Führer. Again, there was broad approval at the ballot box. In Moscow, the 17th Party Congress thunderously applauded Nikolai Bukharin as he groveled. In his brilliant application of the Marxist-Lenin dialectics, Stalin was entirely correct. Although Kirov, Kamenev, and Zinoviev sang from Bukharin's sheet, Bukharin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Kirov were still all shot. Of the 1,966 delegates at the 17th Congress of the All-Union Communist Party, 1,108 were arrested. Although Kirov's killing was an unsanctioned murder, it turned up the wick on Stalin's paranoia.
But the regime as a whole, the leadership, were concerned about counter-revolution. It's not particularly surprising. They were students of revolution. So they asked themselves, even before they seized power, why did the French Revolution fail? Why did 1848 fail? Why did the Paris Commune fail? And the conclusion that they drew was that revolutionary movements were never ready, adequately prepared for the counter-revolution that inevitably came. So the Bolsheviks were determined to be ready for the counter-revolution.
These preparations would dominate Soviet life from the murder of Kirov to the show trials in the spring of 1938. In France, there was no terror. There were no show trials, but they found their own way of creating the instability that seemed to damn the 30s everywhere. The Stravinsky scandal was a catalyst for, rather than a cause of, discontent.
There's an explosion in French politics. On the 6th of February, 1934, various politicians had been found to be involved in a financial scandal called the Stravinsky scandal. And so a group of right-wing extreme demonstrators gather outside Parliament just across the river. And then at some moment, nobody knows exactly what happened. Some of the demonstrators run to try and break down the police barricade. No one knows who fired first. It may have been the police, it may have been demonstrators. Shooting broke out, and about 9 of the demonstrators were killed.
Street demonstrations left 15 dead and as many as 1,500 injured. But they were not about Stravinsky or anything in particular. They were about anxiety. They were a turning point.
The left becomes radicalized because it fears the right is fascist, and the right becomes radicalized because it thinks democracy is incapable of actually solving the problems of France.
On October 9th, the French foreign minister, Louis Barthou, was killed, struck by a stray bullet intended for the Yugoslav king.
Barthou sees the threat from Germany, sets about trying to strengthen France's alliances with Eastern Europe. It's a traditional, you might say, conservative idea: build up your alliances against Germany. A lot of people say the assassination of Barthou was a real turning point into war French history. It's the moment when French politicians, conservative politicians, gave up the idea, lost the will, as it were, to build up their allies in the East against Germany.
British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden later described the shooting of Barthou and King Alexander I as the first shots of the Second World War. On July 25th, Engelbert Dollfuss, the Austrian Chancellor, was murdered, intensifying Mussolini's fear of an Anschluss, a unification of Austria with Germany.
This would bring the borders right up to the Brenner Pass in the German-speaking region of Italy that had been given to Italy as part of the peace conference in 1918. So this was hugely worrying to Mussolini at this time. An Anschluss would also really strengthen Germany's control of Central Europe.
Mussolini's response to Dollfuss's assassination was to move 4 divisions up to the frontier, threatening to beat any German force into Austria if necessary.
Mussolini was outraged, and this really causes a severe rupture in relations between fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Mussolini actually begins an anti-Nazi propaganda campaign in the media, and he says Hitler is Dollfuss's murderer.
His gesture was sufficient to halt German plans. He later remarked to his wife, "I expected more from our Western friends, Rochelle. They've let me down. Their apathy could have been disastrous." With Europe in disarray, Britain and France were more than ever intimidated by their exposure to a range of global challenges. The Saar region, with its rich coal fields, was returned to Germany following another plebiscitary success on January 13th, 1935. At the conclusion of 15 years of French control, as mandated by the peace agreement, a referendum revealed that just under 91% of the population preferred Hitler to France. On March 16th, Hitler announced the introduction of general military service. He was creating a new army of 35 divisions, or, as one newspaper saw it, taking the first great measure to liquidate Versailles. In September, the Nuremberg laws were passed. The best known of some 400 anti-Jewish laws handed down between 1933 and 1939. The same month, an order was made installing the swastika as the official flag of the Reich. A symbol that had positive connotations for centuries was forever corrupted by Nazi Germany. In North Africa, on October 3rd, 1935, Italian troops crossed the Ethiopian border and the first bombs fell on Adowa.
Italy had unsuccessfully tried to invade and gain control of Ethiopia in the 1890s. Ethiopia was one of only 2 independent territories left in Africa that it was not under some kind of European colonial control. So there was a sense for Mussolini of trying to complete what previous liberal governments of the 19th century had been unable to do. And this is part of what's underpinning the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, the desire to achieve an Italian empire.
Italy's invasion was not unexpected, and no one was surprised, though many pretended they were.
There were also accords between France and Italy that had been drawn up in 1935, which essentially meant that France was giving Italy a free hand in Ethiopia. And similarly, Britain were not in any way in favour of the invasion of Ethiopia, but at the same time were not willing to go to war against Italy in order to stop it. So this was very important in Italy understanding that actually if it were to wage war, that it could do so with very limited opposition.
With the unprovoked attack and the fact that he got away with it, Mussolini had unhinged the interwar order.
On the threshold,
It is us today, Ethiopia's deposed emperor foretold. It will be you tomorrow.
we do not want war, but we will not undergo it passively.
2 weeks after Italian forces crossed into Ethiopia, Hitler, who knew what it was to lose a war, told his officers, "Rearm and get ready. Europe is on the move again. If we are clever, we will be the winners."